Hello, I'm Tino Cuellar, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you for joining us today. War in Europe loomed large in the 20th century and in the early history of this institution, and it remains tragically relevant to our mission this morning. In the fall of 2021, American intelligence agencies became clearly aware of a plan that Vladimir Putin had, a plan to attack Ukraine. Some officials even warned the public about it, but the shock was nonetheless enormous when the invasion descended on a European country of 41 million people. Now it's been days, and already the conflict has had a pretty massive toll. UNHCR estimates that nearly 3.1 million refugees have fled Ukraine since late February. The world is riveted by Ukrainians, by images of their president, by resolve, bravery of ordinary Ukrainians as they defend their country from an invasion for which there's no excuse. But the conflict's also affecting the entire world in ways that reflect how countries are entangled in a web of somewhat common fate. I remember exactly where I was on 9/11. Probably many of you do, most of you do. And this invasion feels like it's unleashed something of an inflection point that is comparable perhaps for geopolitics, for global order, for the economy. I'm just going to give you one telling example, but I give you many. Russia and Ukraine account for nearly a third of all international wheat sales, a major staple for the global food economy. So maybe it's not surprising that prices, whether you're in Europe or Africa, have already risen by an average of roughly 30% since the invasion started. And that's from historically high prices that we were already seeing in early 2022. It's not surprising. So many countries are being impacted by sanctions, by counter-sanctions, trade, food, migration, possible changes in geopolitics, raising profound questions as massive as the flow of refugees about how the conflict will affect, for example, U.S. and China relations long-term, how it'll end. All these developments have reinforced the importance of our mission to generate independent analysis, to develop ideas with a bent towards action and cooperation that isn't naive. Sometimes this means working behind the scenes to share ideas with key decision makers, taking part in unofficial diplomacy. But sensible outcomes begin with serious efforts to understand what's happening and to map out how this matters for the entire world. With us to advance this part of our mission are several of my remarkable Carnegie colleagues whose expertise covers the world and will help us understand how this conflict is affecting the world. Ashley Tellis works on South Asia and geopolitics. Karim Sadjadpour is an expert on the Middle East. Judy Dempsey covers Europe for us. Sasha Gabuev is an expert on Russia and China. And Rose Gottemoeller is a former Undersecretary of International Security at the U.S. State Department and NATO official, and helped open up our Carnegie Moscow Center nearly 30 years ago. And our moderator is the illustrious Mary Louise Kelly of National Public Radio. She's an award-winning host of All Things Considered, the former national security correspondent for NPR, and also, I'm pleased to say, my college classmate from the class of 1993 at Harvard. Thank you for what you do, Mary Louise, and for working with us to help our audience better understand the world. You have the floor.
Well, thank you. A lovely greeting from an old classmate. It is wonderful to be with you. It is wonderful to be with Carnegie and with all of you this morning. I echo only that it is awful that it is under these circumstances of horror in Ukraine and of Vladimir Putin destroying, I would argue, or attempting to destroy not one country, but two, because Russia will also take many years to heal from this. The good news is I do have 5 of Carnegie's most thoughtful experts here, eager to help us all make sense of it. So we're going to dive in. Our format is we are going to talk and get to as much as we can dig into for an hour. I'm going to thread your questions through as we go, and certainly save time to get to some of them at the end. So with that, let's hear from the experts. I thought what I might do, just to set the stage, is invite each of you to take, 1 minute at the most, a few sentences just to lay out from your patch, your area of scholarship, what feels like the most urgent question today, 3 weeks in officially today, since Russia invaded. What are the stakes? What's the foremost question on your mind as you woke up this morning? And Judy, I'm going to let you kick us off because you track Europe, and we're of course sadly talking about a major war unfolding in 2022 in Europe. Oh, and I think we may need you to unmute. hit that unmute button one more time.
It's as if I was, yeah. Thank you for having me on this program. Hello, Timo. Hello, Mary Louise and all my colleagues. It's a very difficult question. 1 minute I have. My fear is that Europe may go back to the comfort zone. Despite the wars in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, Europe was actually in a comfort zone for such a long time. Secondly, this invasion of Ukraine is puncturing this comfort zone because it gets to the heart of actually the peace project that the European Union was built on. There's an immense fear that the war will spill over, but there's also another sentiment that it's over there still. This is despite the fact that 3 million refugees, close to 3 million refugees, are coming to Europe, being given an enormous warm welcome in Poland and in Germany and in other countries. The other aspect is the sanctions. Europe has imposed the sanctions and with enormous pressure from the Biden administration. But I just wonder, is the European public actually going to sustain this? There are now complaints about energy prices, about inflation. So in some ways, the Europeans say, yes, we support Ukraine, great fighters, great Zelensky, wonderful, wonderful. But I just wonder, are they prepared to actually carry the can and go down the long road? This is going to be a very, very long war. It seems, at least from the analysts here in the intelligence circles across Europe. But I just wonder, will this unity break up at one stage? And more importantly, will some countries go it alone in really openly defending Ukraine? The stakes are very high, and the whole tragedy unfolded every evening on television and the radio. Is no escaping from it, but I just wonder how long Europe can stick together on this.
Okay, good. So that's helpful. A lot of questions you're raising there about ability to stay the course for what looks like maybe a longer conflict than anyone would hope for. Thank you. We will come back to that. Why don't we go in alphabetical order by last name, which I think would put you up next, Sasha.
Thanks, Mary Louise. I think that unfortunately the ugliest pages of this war are not behind us, but in front of us. The diplomatic negotiation track, unfortunately, is a sideshow for now, and Vladimir Putin is likely to seek leverage and victory on the battlefield, not on the negotiation table. So we're going to see much more terrible things coming our way, and we're going to see more sanctions. So the second order, third order issues that Tina alluded to, wheat prices, inflations, are there. Unfortunately, my prediction is that the way that Russia turns into Iran and maybe North Korea is pretty sustainable. The regime is able to sustain its current shape, being more repressive, and that amount of sanctions would put the price tag and cost to Russia, to the Russian people and the regime, but is unlikely to change the regime in short and medium term. So here is the way on how do you calibrate the sanctions without causing major disruptions to the global economy and affecting the developing world. And final point, Russia, China was also mentioned. The asymmetry between the two countries was there. That will be massively accelerated by this war. And Russia is very likely to move closer to China as a junior partner, providing China with the most advanced designs of weapons, most sophisticated parts of its nuclear expertise, and actually China will get out strengthened, not weakened out of this crisis. Over.
Oh, interesting. All right. I look forward to exploring that with you. I suspect there'll be a number of questions from our audience as well about China and where they fit into this. Thank you. Rose Gottemoeller, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary Louise, and thank you to Carnegie for this really interesting panel this morning. I wanted to bring up a topic that's been on so many people's lips. That's the no-fly zone over Ukraine, and that has been a kind of cause célèbre across Europe and in the United States as well. I was interested to see that when President Zelensky addressed the Congress yesterday in that really heartfelt speech, it was amazing. He is such a good communicator, and he's done it today in front of the German parliament as well. But this issue of a no-fly zone is a bit, I think, of a misplaced priority. And I noted that Zelensky yesterday shifted his focus ever so slightly to protecting the skies over Ukraine. And that is a good thing. They do not have an air superiority problem because Russia is not flying aircraft over Ukraine. Those missiles that struck the military base near Lviv over the weekend apparently came from bombers flying over Russian territory, launching air-launched cruise missiles. So it's not a problem of air superiority over Ukraine. It is a missile defense problem. So I am actually very glad today to see that the Slovakian government, for example, is apparently sending missile defense systems, the S-300, to Ukraine. I think this is a good sign. They've been supplying, a number of allies have been supplying more capable air-to-ground defensive capabilities, and that's good. I also take note that Putin apparently has noticed, because the Russians have now said that supplying air defense capability to Ukraine is a bad thing.
All right, so laying out some of the military challenges unfolding now and to come. Thank you. Karim Sadjadpour, nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, Louise. Great to see all of you. So President Biden's foremost policy in the Middle East has been to try to revive the Iran nuclear deal. And up until now, Russia has played a key intermediary role between the United States and Iran, because Iran won't speak directly to U.S. diplomats. And so it looked like we were on the cusp of this deal being revived just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in the aftermath of that, I think Russia suddenly felt it had conflicting interests, because on one hand, Russia has a major financial stake in Iran's nuclear program. They wanted to see this deal revived. At the same time, overnight, Russia eclipsed Iran as the most sanctioned nation on earth. And they didn't want to facilitate the re-entry of Iranian oil back into the market if that was going to mitigate the pain that the world would feel from the embargo against Russian oil. So I think what we've seen over the last week is that Russia seemingly secured its interests, and that it secured guarantees from the United States that it's not going to be sanctioned for its nuclear cooperation with Iran. And there was a fleeting hope that perhaps this Russian gambit would actually bring the United States and Iran somewhat closer to one another, perhaps foster a direct dialogue between the United States and Iran. But I think how this is more likely to play out in the coming months and years is a closer Russian-Iranian relationship, because both of them will share this number one priority for both of them of opposing the US-led world order. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Last but certainly not least, Ashley Tellis, welcome.
Thank you, Mary Louise. It's a pleasure to be here with you and all my colleagues this morning. I've been looking closely at the Indian response to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And it's striking because in recent times, India has joined with the United States in very strongly advocating the protection of the rules-based international order. And yet, India abstained from 3 UN Security Council votes, which had as their objective the condemnation of the Russian invasion, which on the face of it puts India at odds with the wider international consensus. And what I find striking is that this choice that New Delhi exercised with respect to abstaining on the UN Security Council votes indicates the acute dilemma that India faces because of the invasion. I mean, to put it just very plainly, the Indians hate the Russian invasion of Ukraine because it threatens the global order. It presages a closer Russian relationship with China, with whom India has severe geopolitical problems of its own. And yet the Indians find themselves in a position where they cannot publicly censor the Russians for fear of losing Russian support, both political support vis-a-vis China and Russia as a source of military weaponry, which India has been long dependent upon. And so the Indians made the very difficult choice of abstaining and censuring the Russians in very coded terms. So if you read the Indian statement, They advocated respect for sovereignty. They wanted to uphold territorial integrity of states and so on and so forth, but without calling the Russians by name. Now, all this leads to a series of questions for me going forward. First, will the Indian bet on, in a sense, protecting their equities with Russia actually pay off in the face of what will be Russian weakness as a result of very strong Western sanctions? That's question number one. Question number two, since India values its relationship with the key European states, including those that are at the forefront of opposing the Russian invasion, what is the impact of this abstention on India's relations with its key European partners? And third, of course, what is the impact of the Indian abstention on the United States? Since the US now for 20 odd years has bet strongly on India, not simply because of the convergence in interest, but fundamentally because of the convergence in values as well. Now, obviously, I don't have the answers to any of these three questions now, but they are certainly the most pressing issues that I think weigh on New Delhi at this point as it thinks about the evolution of this crisis.
Thank you. Fascinating. All right. So I think y'all have given us so much, set the table beautifully with so many things to dig in with. I'll just start picking my way back through. I will say, now that we are all gathered together, what I said to all of you when we were backstage or whatever the Zoom equivalent is, feel free to jump in, interrupt each other, interrupt me. If you hear something you want to make a comment on, please do. But I want to follow, because one of the striking things about this is we are back to talking about kind of a great power struggle on the continent of Europe. And so I want to tick through a couple of follow-ups on the Greek powers who are observing this and trying to figure out what their role in this is, and we'll find our way from there. Let me just stay with you, Ashley, because we've just heard from you for a second. I have been trying to make sense of what India's position is, and it is striking because if you were just to look at this in the abstract, this is the world's biggest democracy. Zelensky has so successfully framed the Ukrainian resistance as a fight for democratic values. And I've been trying to figure out how that resonates in India. As I have tracked India's role in here, it has struck me as a kind of hedging its bets. But what you just described sounds more like India, not cornered, but kind of stuck, trying to figure out from the Department of not really any good options for how it navigates this. Does that sound fair?
I think that's an accurate description. I don't think it's hedging its bets in the sense that India has, of course, chosen, but it's chosen its interests over the competition with values. They appreciate what the values in contention are, including the destruction of a liberal rules-based order. They understand that. But they are so dependent on the Russians in so many ways. And they are so afraid of the prospect of an even tighter Russian-China embrace that they are hoping that sitting on the sidelines will give them continued leverage with Moscow. And that Moscow will remember when a crisis for China comes down the line, that India did not set out to censor the Russians as many other states have done. And I would really be interested in actually hearing from Sasha on this one, because this is a huge Indian bet. It can be understood against the backdrop of India's past relations with Russia. But I wonder, given the changed circumstances now in Russia and in Europe, and also the weakness that Putin himself may experience as a result of this caper going south, whether this Indian bet might prove to be falsified.
Sasha, please jump in, the view from Beijing.
I think that the concern is very real. For now, China definitely doesn't want to be seen as supporting Russia. It does only what's permitted by the sanctions. And I think that China will follow the sanctions themselves quite religiously. The problem that a lot will be outside of the scope of sanctions, since Europeans will continue to buy Russian oil and gas for the short and medium term. And that makes this legit. And then everything outside of this will be possible. So now China waits till the Russian economy really finds its bottom, and it's in a state of free fall. Why would you do anything tangible right now to support the Russians? But then you come in and do stuff that is legitimate. And for other stuff that Russians might want, you probably use your model of cooperation with Iran and North Korea. And then the long continental border makes that just simpler. But in return, you ask Russia to support you on many issues that Russia never wanted to support you before. And I'm afraid that India-China border conflict is one example. Nine-Dash Line in the South China Sea is another example. And then transfer of the most sensitive weapon systems that Russia was reluctant to sell to the Chinese is now all possible. It's a different country after February 24. So its relationship with everybody else is a very different relationship that needs to be explored.
Sasha, what is your sense of communication at this moment between Beijing and Russia? To what extent are they coordinating, sharing information? Do we know? Are Putin and Xi on the phone?
They don't. I think that Chinese contacts I talk to are as shocked as many people are. They read the assessments of the U.S. intelligence community in the media. The U.S. government shared some intelligence assessment with the Chinese, but the move is just so reckless, so irrational, and going so much against the core national interests of Russia that Chinese are like till the late moments, till the last moment, really never believed that this will happen. So they pretend like they are keeping some communication line. There is a Western pressure for China to do something, to play a mediation role, or to put pressure on Russia, which they don't want to do. So they will keep in contact with the Russian, but there is zero meaningful coordination. They know that Russians don't need them to win this war, as ugly as it is on Russian terms, just being much more brutal than anticipated in the very beginning of this ugly campaign.
Louise, could I? Sorry, I just want to ask Sasha a question, if that's okay. Yesterday, the Chinese ambassador to the United States put out, well, it was an op-ed in the Washington Post, all about how China stands for sovereignty and territorial integrity, et cetera, and all these lies about China knowing in advance about the invasion and so forth and so on, and not being willing to help with military assistance. I'm just curious what you make of that, Sasha, from where you sit in Moscow, but also your perspective as a China expert.
Well, China has a very well-developed narrative and talking points since at least 2014 annexation of Crimea. And these talking points include support for peace, territorial integrity and sovereignty over Ukraine, mild criticism towards unilateral sanctions that don't help the problem, and now criticism towards expansion of US-led alliances, meaning both NATO and AUKUS. And depending on the audience, Chinese just cherry pick the parts of this message. So it's only normal that Xinjiang went out to the major US paper and underlined this parts of support for peace, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of Ukraine. I totally believe that there was no discussion between Putin and Xi on what's likely to happen, because you saw the meeting of the Russian National Security Council, and the closest member of Putin's war cabinet were visibly shaken and shocked because they only realized what happened. So I don't believe that Putin has shared this with a foreign leader in presence of other diplomats. They didn't have one-on-one. They had some translator for his perceived operational security reasons. So here I totally believe the Chinese ambassador. But again, China is a very selfish power. It really cares about its own interests. It doesn't care about Ukraine or Russia for that matter. And just underscoring the parts of the message, talking to the West, is really an imperative for them.
Judy, I see you wanting to.
Thank you. Two quick points. One on India's position. I think France was incredibly disappointed with this. And over the years, France has developed a very sophisticated intelligence, strategic, military training exercises with India. We've seen this over the past couple of years, and contracts as well with military equipment. So France does certainly seem quite disappointed if not let down by India. France will not walk away from this strategic relationship with India because France's strategic interests are actually focused on this part of the world as well. This is the first point. The second point is Sasha's point. Putin got such a big PR when Xi said he would support Russia when it comes to NATO expansion, but that was such a small present for Putin. But from the Chinese point of view, for Putin it was very, very big because it was a signal to NATO. But in return, Sasha, I think this is confirmed. I mean, China is looking after its own interests, and these are clearly getting more energy supplies from Russia. So this is about interest, not doing, just giving a verbal present. Putin isn't a big deal.
I have one that I'll throw up as a jump ball, I think probably for Sasha and Rose. This is just in case we don't make our way back before we get too far away from China. Taiwan. As we consider the questions for how this is reshaping world order and has the ability to spill over far beyond Europe, there have been many questions, as you know, about whether China is eyeing Taiwan and eyeing what's happening in Ukraine and plotting its next move. Is that the right question to be asking? To what extent do you see parallels or total dissimilarities between China's designs on Taiwan, Russia's designs on Ukraine?
I think it's different and they are not synchronized. It's not that Putin made this reckless and terrible move on Ukraine that China will believe that the US attention is somewhere else and will jump on Taiwan. In order to enforce observation of Taiwan into PRC on Chinese terms and putting the gun on the table, you first need to make this gun really big and scary. And for that, they need a nuclear deterrence on par with the United States. That's what they are busy doing right now. They need about a decade to do this. And then other conventional elements. So it's not like 10, 15 years from now. But I think the lessons they've learned watching on the fallout of the Russian operation, that actually the Russians believe their economy is sanctions proof, where in fact it's not. So if you want to do something like Putin did, or if you want to take Taiwan by force, you really need to sanction proof your economy much better. And it's basically a live simulation going in front of their eyes. So imagine that they will double down on indigenous innovation, double down on creating an economy that's really much more easier to cut ties with the rest of the global economy. I think that's where the focus will be for the next 10, 15 years.
Rose, you want to jump on that? And then I'm going to take us to the Middle East.
Just really quickly, and Sasha may smile at this, but I was just reading this morning an alleged, and I stress alleged, leak out of the FSB that she had been planning to invade Taiwan this fall, but then has pulled back on account of the disaster that is unfolding before us and before him in Ukraine. So I do think, and I more important than this alleged leak, I think is the point Sasha made about watching the sanctions regime unfold and the effects it's having, not only sanctions per se, but also high-tech export controls and the effects that they are having on Russia. That is something that she does not want to see coming to affect the Chinese economy. And so perhaps there is a greater deterrent effect, at least in this immediate period, than anything else.
Let me steer us to the Middle East and to your patch, Karim, because we're obviously, again, talking about a conflict playing out for the moment in Europe, but with potential to reshape dynamics in the Middle East, already reshaping dynamics in the Middle East. I have an Israel question for you, but first, the Iran question. You alluded to nuclear talks, where we all wait to see whether there will be any progress there. But a question that I think a lot of people have had on their mind, the obvious one, and I'm curious where you land. If you are sitting in Tehran, watching Ukraine being pulverized, a country that voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances. If you're watching Russia, where there is no appetite in the West for a no-fly zone, because if you had to put your finger on it, they are a nuclear superpower, and who wants to go in direct combat with that? What lesson do you take away if you're Iran and you're at a table where the West is trying to get you to give up your nuclear ambitions?
It's a terrific question, Mary Louise, and you could add to Iran's data points Libya and Saddam Hussein, right? You know, two leaders, Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, who gave up their nuclear programs and were deposed by external force. I think the challenge Iran has is that it probably recognizes that its nuclear program has been totally penetrated by U.S. and Israeli intelligence. So they've had many clandestine facilities over the years that have been either sabotaged or publicly revealed. And so I've always thought that Iran's aspirations are to pursue the Japan model, to be kind of a screwdriver turn away from having a nuclear weapon, but to not actually cross that threshold and become like North Korea. But precisely because of the questions you raised, I'm sure there is probably much more robust debate in Iran about what the end game should be. And if I can add something in addition, just to widen the aperture, because Ashley talked about India's dilemma about their values and their interests, and I think this Russian invasion of Ukraine will sharpen the debate in Washington about our values versus our interests in many regions of the world, but in particular the Middle East, and in particular our relationship with our longtime partners in the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia became, after the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi a few years ago, President Biden referred to them as a pariah during the campaign, that we should isolate them. But we're now seeing, as oil prices go up, we need Saudi Arabia, we need our major energy partners in the region. And I had a senior official in one of the Persian Gulf countries say to me last December, he said, if you guys are entering a new Cold War, and at that time he meant a new Cold War with China, didn't even think about an additional aspect of that with Russia, but he said, if you're entering a new Cold War, you need to have a big tent strategy. You should not be pushing your partners and your allies away. And 5-10 years ago, we may have said, well, it's an empty threat that these countries would ever abandon their partnerships with the United States and tilt towards Beijing and Moscow. But nowadays, it's not as black and white as it was before. China can offer them 5G technology, things that we haven't been able to offer them yet. China offers them help on drones, which is where they're getting hammered by Iran. There's talk of China buying a stake in Saudi or Aramco. And so I think it's really going to force a difficult debate in the United States about, do we continue to emphasize our values, human rights, or do we simply need these partners more than ever? And what's going to further amplify that debate is when and if this Iran nuclear deal is revived. And I think it is a pretty strong likelihood that it will be revived, because suddenly Iran will be getting a major cash windfall. And among the things they're going to double down on are their regional proxies, like the Houthis in Yemen, Lebanese Hezbollah, Shia militias in Iraq, the Assad regime, all of whom constitute a threat to our longtime regional partners in both the Gulf and in Israel.
What about Israel? As you watch Israel trying to navigate this conflict, they have a new prime minister, a new leader who is giving Macron a run for his money and trying to be the diplomatic peacemaker in chief, shuttling around, hedging their bets. How would you describe where they fit in here?
Well, Israel is in a unique position because they have a close relationship with Putin, and Zelensky being a Jewish leader of Ukraine, and there being a very strong Ukrainian Jewish community in Israel and an existing Jewish community in Ukraine. He's probably been, I would argue, more effective than Macron as an intermediary. They don't benefit from, like many countries, they don't benefit from this war and embargo against Russia, rising oil prices. And I would say to the credit of Israel's leadership and Prime Minister Bennett, although they do have major differences with the United States, particularly about the revival of the Iran nuclear deal, they've managed those differences in a way behind closed doors, which has been much more effective and less partisan than Prime Minister Netanyahu managed those differences.
I want to talk about one character who's in the center of all this. When I was thinking of what I wanted to ask, I was reminded of something you told me, Karim, in an interview on a very different topic. I interviewed you a couple months ago on the 2-year anniversary since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. And I was asking you, who's replaced him? And you said, well, he's not really replaceable. And you quoted something from Kissinger that you remembered, where Kissinger had talked about. Do you remember what I'm talking about? Do you want to say it?
Yes. Kissinger said that before he went into government, he wrote this in his memoirs years ago. He said, before he went into government, when he was a professor at Harvard, he thought that the individual didn't really matter in history, that nations ultimately pursue their own natural interests, regardless of who was in power. And he said it was only after he served in government when he reached the opposite conclusions, that the individual actually matters profoundly in history, and individuals can really shape history. And we absolutely see that in the person of a Vladimir Putin. Now, we saw that in the United States with Donald Trump. And so I'll stop here, but I've long joked with my students at Georgetown University that if I were to kind of redo my education, I'd probably study psychology rather than political science, because certainly when it comes to the Middle East, the psychology of individual leaders and then traumatized societies has been much better indicator of things than studying the interests of nation states.
Yeah. I think that's such an interesting frame to look at a few characters. There's obviously, you just raised Putin and the ability of this one person to upend a continent. Zelensky is the other one who obviously comes to mind, and we can go to either of those if y'all have thoughts. I also hope we get to, and I'll throw this to you, Judy, Olaf Scholz, who has taken over in Germany and done things I would certainly not have bet money on if you had asked me 1 month ago where he would be leading his country and its response to this crisis. Do you want to take that on? And if y'all want to jump off that, feel free.
Well, Olaf Scholz is an innate-born politician. That's the first thing. And he knows when the wind blows a certain direction, he has to move. But this has been an extraordinary change for him. He gave a 30-minute speech in the German parliament 2 weeks ago, on a Sunday, and just tore up the rule book. Essentially, for once, a German chancellor stopped looking at Eastern Europe through the prism of Russia, because in the past, Eastern Europe, by the German elites, was always looked through the prism of Russia. That's the first thing. Secondly, earlier he just stopped the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which his predecessor Angela Merkel should have stopped a very long time ago. And thirdly, I think he overturned, tore up another rule book about defense. Defense spending is going to be at least 2% of GDP, 100 billion upfront to modernize an appalling, shambolic German armed forces. And what he has really done is taken on the pacifist wing of the SPD. He's taken on the American wing of the SPD, and he's taken on this kind of reluctance to be involved. He's taken on the reluctance to always be sitting on the fence. For the moment, those days are over. Big question is, can he keep on board the skeptics inside his party? They've all gone into boroughs now because they don't want to be. They want to go along with him to keep the government strong. But it's early days. It's still shaky. Germany is having this arcane debate about energy imports. They are still importing energy from Russia. They won't go the long haul. They won't actually end this relationship right now and put the whole side onto Europe. It's a little bit fragile. Scholz is still leading. He's got to be much, much more forceful. And hopefully Zelensky's powerful speech in the German parliament today will actually galvanize finally this ambiguity of the German political elites.
Rose, do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, and Judy, I appreciate your use of the word shambolic to refer to the German armed forces. While I was DSG of NATO from 2016 to 19, that was very much in evidence. So I personally am really delighted to see this 180-degree shift in both German public opinion and also in the attitudes of the German coalition at the moment, and the policies have followed. I wanted to go back to these two presidents, though, that are facing off at the moment in this horrific and barbaric invasion of Ukraine. President Zelensky, the heroic figure, the good communicator, as I put it, and President Putin, who is crouched inside the Kremlin with his cohort around him and his bubble over his head. So, but nevertheless, I do want to say, and I disagree a bit with Sasha on this, I do think that some important steps have been taken on the diplomatic front in the past week. Both men, both Putin and Zelensky, have taken important steps toward each other. And in Putin's case, it has been to drop this demand for denazification and regime change, that is, getting rid of the Zelensky government in Ukraine. For Zelensky, it has been to say that he would be willing to consider the notion of neutrality for Ukraine. And that is, as I understand, what is being negotiated at the present time, with the Ukrainians also demanding the withdrawal to the pre-February 24th borders. The situation is very fluid. I'm just scrolling through the press and seeing that they're now demanding the 1991 borders. So I'm not sure exactly where that's going to land, but it is a negotiation. And I think that that is important. The other thing that is important is that it is a quiet negotiation. Unlike what we saw before the invasion, when the Russians were unrelenting in their megaphone diplomacy, this has been a quiet negotiation, which I also take as a good sign. Maybe they're actually getting some serious work done.
We have questions coming in, and let me remind those of you listening, feel free to feed us questions. I can take them at the end, or I can thread them in if they're topical as we go. So to that end, let me pose one. This is coming in from Jen Schwartzman-Holtzman on Facebook, asking, given Putin's willingness to take control of civilian nuclear facilities in Ukraine by force, do the panelists think he would consider additional nuclear options? Who wants to grab that one?
Well, I guess I'm a natural one to start on that. And Jen, thank you for the excellent question. This actually contradicts what I was saying a moment ago about some sensible diplomacy going on, because we still have to deal with the erratic, it's probably nice to say eccentric behavior of Vladimir Putin at the moment. Some would say irrational behavior. Apparently, he just grabbed like the bit between his teeth, the comments that were made by President Zelensky and Kuleba, the foreign minister, in the run-up to the invasion, about some aspirations in Ukraine for nuclear capability once again, after having given it up in 1994. And for that reason, I think he has the Russian armed forces have pushed to seize these facilities, to destroy the isotope production facility in Kharkiv, which is a great shame because that was for cancer treatment, those isotopes, and to hold on now to the Zaporozhye power plant as well as to Chernobyl. I think this is all kind of a symbolic act, but it pushes in that direction of nuclear saber rattling and trying to really frighten the world with the notion that he could go nuclear, perhaps with a single strike against Ukraine, perhaps with something like a nuclear demonstration strike over the Black Sea. So I am worried about that. I actually, at the moment, am more worried about what I see to be all of this talk about chemical weapons and biological weapons, and that the Ukrainians, the Russians say the Ukrainians are going to use them. It's clear from the intelligence that is again being released in a very good way by the US and the UK that this is all about Russian aspirations and a false flag attempt in Ukraine, once again, using a chemical or biological agent. I think it's good that there is no impunity here, because already the US and the UK have been calling them out on this, but it is a continuing danger, a continuing threat. But I see the chem and bio side as a more likely threat at the moment than the nuclear side, but we cannot exclude it.
Anybody else want to touch nuclear chem bio before we move on? Going once?
Well, I would just make the point, Mary Louise, that it's the way the West, and in particular the United States, has responded to Putin's saber rattling is actually worthy of note, which is we have not taken the bait. We have not made this a nuclear competition with the Russians. And I think that is exactly the way to play it, because it is in Putin's interest to feign escalation. And it is certainly in our interest to dampen it in every way we can, without, of course, reneging on our deterrence threats and all the rest that are required to prevent him from actually doing some damage.
We've been speaking just now about potential escalation and spillover into nuclear chem bio, which we hope is a conversation that I'm trying to think will not be short, but that is not the direction we are headed. Let me ask about concerns on people's minds about spillover beyond Ukraine's national borders. There was great concern, given Putin has a track record of invading other countries and designs on other countries, of whether, had things gone more to plan in these first 3 weeks, he might have designs and just keep going to Moldova. I am leaving for Tbilisi tomorrow, and in preparation for that reporting trip, have been asking people in Georgia how they see this, and it's a mix of real apprehension. Oh my God, how crazy is he? Like, are we next again? This is another, as you know, non-NATO member, non-EU member that Putin has a history of invading. I'm hearing a little bit more now, the sense maybe he has his hands full, has realized he's bitten off plenty to chew with Ukraine, and we're not looking beyond that. But Judy, do you want to take that one? What is your sense for
great
deliberate invasion or one missile that goes the wrong side of the Polish border?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the scope for mistakes and errors are just huge, and the unpredictability. A couple of points. Let's touch Poland in a second. Moldova is Putin really is incredibly upset what happened to Moldova over the past year. There's a young, pro-European government led by two super highly educated women, a young cabinet, very gung-ho, pro-Western, pro-EU. They have been remarkable at this poor country dealing with refugees. They've been extremely calm. Georgia has beginning to pull itself together. It's been a very discombobulated opposition government over the past couple of months, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine has galvanized Georgia together. Now, what is very, very important is the European language that, yes, enlargement is finally on the cards for these countries. It's not going to happen overnight, but they have a concrete perspective, whether it's real, whether it's ambiguous, whether it's insincere. It gives these governments, puts something into their pockets. Finally, we're going to the West one day, we're going to get more integrated. The country to watch out, and nobody talks about it now, is Belarus. It's in such bad shape, but there's defections from the army, there's more repression. Belarus is in the fold of Russia, but it's not as stable or under control as Lukashenko may want us to believe. And finally, the big fifth largest country in the EU, Poland. Poland has been extraordinary in dealing with the refugees, but it has this special understanding of what Zelensky and the Ukrainians are doing. And the United States is not very happy with what Poland would like to do. But at the moment, Poland is sticking to the EU agenda and the NATO agenda. But one mistake by Russia in Ukraine, and it could turn the tables for NATO when it comes to a kind of Polish retaliation. So essentially, we've got enlargement out there in the language. We have Poland being foreign policy wise and support for Ukraine incredibly strong, and the big country out there, Germany, has now to push the agenda much further.
We've been talking about the relationship of China with Russia, of Iran with Russia, of India with Russia. How about the U.S. with Russia? Where does this leave the U.S. Russia relationship? Yesterday, one of you just nodded to the Jake Sullivan call with his Russian counterpart. To my knowledge, that is the most high-level contact between the Kremlin and the White House since this war began. None of the issues that were issues between these two countries have gone away, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's arms control talks, any number, cooperation on any number of fronts or lack thereof. Rose, the way forward for the U.S.-Russia relationship, what does that look like? What do we need to not lose track of as we watch the devastation that's so granular and urgent right now in Ukraine?
The June summit in 2021 in Geneva between Biden and Putin seems very long ago and far away at this point. President Biden yesterday called Putin a war criminal. The Kremlin immediately said this is unforgivable. So have to say the relationship between those two men is shot. I've been racking my brain about how we get back to the nuclear negotiating table with Russia, because they continue to be the largest, along with the United States, the largest two nuclear powers on the face of the earth. We both have over 4,000 nuclear warheads. We have a responsibility to keep that relationship stable and non-escalatory, but we also have a responsibility to continue to control and limit those nuclear weapons. So frankly, at the moment, Mary Louise, I'm thinking that perhaps the door through which we go through to get back to some kind of diplomacy is the door that is offered up by the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference that is scheduled at the moment for August. If the P5, the nuclear weapon states under the NPT, and that includes China as well as the UK, France, Russia, and the United States, if we can quietly begin to pull together to try to preserve the non-proliferation regime, I think what has been described by all participating today is pressure, perhaps on the proliferation side, to acquire certainly more conventional weapons, but possibly more nuclear weapons as well. And so I think we all have an interest in preserving and strengthening the nuclear non-proliferation regime and not seeing it fail at this point. So perhaps a kind of multilateral P5 approach is a way that would open a small door to getting back to business in the diplomatic realm with the Russians on the nuclear threat. Just one more thing on this. Traditionally, no matter how bad our differences during the Cold War, no matter how bad the crisis, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we did kind of keep nuclear arms limitation and control in a separate basket and tried to advance on those controls and limitations nevertheless. I don't know if we can do it again, and I'm suspending judgment somewhat, but I do hope, and I think it's necessary somehow to work our way through this conundrum.
Would be nice note of caution is look at the GCPOA and what Russia is doing there. And I think that we are having a very different leader in Vladimir Putin than the Soviet leadership back then. So unfortunately, there is a very emotional element here, and the way he lashes out at the US as trying to subvert his regime and his emotional response to the whole situation is, I think, a huge risk factor here. And as much as we can hope that there is a quiet channel reestablished between Russia and the US, which is crucial, the Russia-Ukraine channel is absolutely not sufficient, because former President Medvedev wrote last year that Russia really looks to talking seriously to the masters, not to the puppets. So without any communication between President Biden and President Putin, it's very unlikely that any discussions between Moscow and Kiev, unfortunately, will lead to a solution here. And then this personal relationship, as Rose rightfully notes, is badly wounded.
Karim, hop in here.
Thank you. So prompted by something that Judy said about defections in Belarus, I wanted to make a comment and frame it as a question to Sasha, because one of the most insightful pieces of political science research which has come out over the last decade was a co-authored piece by two political scientists, Levitsky and Wei, entitled "The Durability of Revolutionary Regimes." And essentially their argument was that authoritarian regimes which are born out of a revolution, going back to Soviet Union, Mao's China, Castro's Cuba, those types of systems tend to last longer than just your run-of-the-mill dictatorship, in part because there is this powerful organizing principle of revolution which helps to cohere the security forces of that nation. And this is my question to Sasha, which is, you could argue, and I'd be curious, Sasha, whether you think Putin's Russia has that type of cohesiveness of a revolutionary regime, because what we saw in the Arab Spring is that security forces don't want to go out and kill to just make Hosni Mubarak, preserve the wealth of Hosni Mubarak and his family, or Ben Ali and his family in Tunisia, or Gaddafi and his family. There has to be, a powerful organizing principle, a cause that they feel that, okay, they're willing to go and sacrifice themselves for. If they see it simply about, preserving the wealth of Lavrov's stepdaughter in London and all the yachts of these other oligarchs, is that something which really affects morale among the Russian security forces, and who will say, listen, I'm not going to die just to keep these oligarchs wealthy. I'm going to jump ship. So that's my question to you, Sasha, and anyone else who wants to jump in.
To me, the regime is remarkably cohesive, and just as one of the proxy metrics, we are in this third week of vicious, terrible conflict, which is very difficult to process on emotional level for many Russians, because the level of ties between ordinary Russians and Ukrainians is enormous. Like, my mother was born in Kiev. I was spending part of my childhood in Kiev. So these ties are basically in many, many families. And that's why this is just very hard to process emotionally, even if you can remain a cold-headed analyst. The problem here, that after 3 weeks, we don't have any single attaché level Russian diplomat walking out of Russian embassy in any Western capital and saying, I denounce this war, I seek political asylum. We don't know of any defections among any civilian bureaucrats. There are some people quietly jumping the ship, but mostly it's state-owned companies and mostly not very visible public figures. So it's the combination of intimidation, material stimulus, and propaganda, which is very efficient. Talking to contacts in Moscow is becoming very difficult because people get very quickly absorbed in the narrative. And then on the law enforcement, I think that Putin has very skillfully trained this division between them, and also loyalty and monetary stimulus. So if you're looking for corruption, the embodiment of corruption are the law enforcement agencies. So they're going to both kind of fight for their own wealth, and they fight for the interests of Mother Russia the way they perceive them. So there is a remarkable cohesion there.
Thank you. Judy, I think you wanted to hop in with a quick comment, and then I'm going to steer us to a couple parts of the world we haven't gotten to yet.
Let's move on. It's okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let me work in a couple of questions. A key relationship that we have not touched on yet, Turkey. There's a question. This is coming in via YouTube from Joseph Wolf. Thank you. What of Turkey's relationship with the West and with Russia at this moment? I don't know if Karim or Ashley, one of you want to take that one?
I'll cede it to Karim.
Well, I think for me, what's been most notable is, this Turkish drone, the Bayraktar, which, I see on social media, Ukrainian women saying they're going to name their children, their sons, Bayraktar, which has played, kind of the same role in this war that the Stinger played in the war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And so, Turkey and Russia, historic rivals, and the Turkish military role here has the drone aid to Ukraine has played a seminal role. Turkey and Russia have also been obvious rivals in the Syria conflict. But both Putin and Erdogan in Turkey have managed for many years now, kind of having geopolitical rivalries with countries while not severing ties with them. So it seems that there is a level of dialogue between Turkey and Russia, even though, as I said, the Turkish drone has really been one of the military stars of this conflict.
Yeah. Rose, how about Turkey as NATO ally? How does that fit in?
Yeah, I've been watching with amazement how Turkey, as one of the bad boys of NATO, has been playing these positive roles in this current invasion, not only providing the drones, as Karim was mentioning, but also trying to facilitate some diplomacy. The Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers met last week in Turkey. So it's much different from when I was NATO Deputy Secretary General, and Turkey had just bought the S-400. And so the United States and NATO was cutting them out of the F-35 program as a result. And they seem to be much, in some senses, closer to Moscow at that point than they were to NATO headquarters. At least that's what a lot of people thought. Now it all seems to be healing. The United States apparently has offered Turkey F-16s, upgraded F-16s in return for, the better behavior. They're no longer the bad boy they were. And we'll see where it goes from here. But I'll just end, Mary Louise, by noting that all the bad boys of NATO, Poland, Hungary, and Turkey, have been performing spectacularly in this horrible crisis. And Hungary itself had terrible differences with Ukraine over the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, which again was the top issue for Hungary and Ukraine while I was at NATO. But all is forgiven now, it seems.
The bad boys of NATO is a phrase I'm not going to be able to get out of my mind now. Thank you. I don't know.
Well, actually, for the bad boys of the EU too, at least Hungary and Poland, they've been under a lot of. Judy can attest, a lot of trouble from the EU side.
Let me see if I can bundle a couple of questions coming in from our audience. One, this is coming in via YouTube. Can the panelists speak to the conflict's implications on climate change consensus? And I will bundle that with, hang on, let me get there. Another question coming in from YouTube. How will this war affect competition in the Arctic? Can China strong-arm Russia on the Arctic given this evolving context? So the Arctic, climate change, how does this scramble what the consensus would have been a month ago on those issues?
I'm happy to start with the Russian angle here. And in Russia is not a big player at the climate change negotiations, but all of the measures that have been introduced last year to kind of have an agenda for sustainable growth and combat climate change are now rolled back because Russia will not be able to continue with modernization of its oil processing plants and many other parts of its economy. So it will be much less green than before because of lack of access to Western technology and Western green finance. And on the Arctic, the issue is that China wanted to use Russia as a proxy to be more visible and more present in the Arctic. That's the only large state with a coastline that would be permissive to Chinese economic and financial interests. And China was a big investor in Russian oil and gas project on Yamal Peninsula and then Arctic LNG. I think now, as Western companies are exiting the Russian market, it's very likely that China will fill the void and find a way to be even more present, and Russia be not able to push back.
Anybody else? China? Climate change. Judy.
A quick comment. It's a really great question, and thanks, Sasha, for your comments. This climate change agenda is creating turmoil in Germany, frankly, because Olaf Scholz says he wants to wean Germany off Russian energy, which will not really happen, and wean Germany off coal, which will happen. Of course, one should actually perhaps use nuclear power for the climate change. And of course, the Greens are absolutely ideologically against this. And even the Green Economy Climate Minister is now saying, well, we still need energy. Guess from where? Because the diversification isn't yet strong enough for Germany. So Germany, which sets us out to be the leader of the green revolution and climate change, has got himself in a bit of a problem on this. First point. Secondly, energy prices, inflation across Europe, unless it's communicated by leaders across the EU, pushing for climate change and the costs of climate change is going to be very difficult. Let's see if the EU is really committed to pushing through the Green Deal.
I wanted to jump in really quickly on the Arctic, but first, Judy's comment about nuclear has really led me to comment that Rosatom and 10X, its commercial arm, are going nuts right now. They had over 1 billion orders on their books for new nuclear power plants around the world, and basically it's all been shot to pieces now. So that, means, I suppose, less nuclear power unless somebody like the ROK or China now steps in to build, to take over that order book that Russia is going to be forced to abandon under sanctions. So again, we'll see if they can climb back in some way from this. It all depends on some kind of peace deal that is acceptable to all, if they're going to get any sanctions relief at all. And we haven't even touched on that. Nobody does, because you don't want to touch on it at this moment. The only other thing I want to say quickly about the Arctic is this was a centerpiece of Russian policy, and they were and they are chairs of the Arctic Council right now, which was a big kind of deal for them. They really wanted to show off their positive policy in the Arctic with the other Arctic member states of the Arctic Council, but the other member states have walked out and are refusing to participate now in Arctic Council meetings under Russian chairmanship.
I had the chance to go up to Murmansk in Russian Arctic a couple of years ago for a reporting trip, and to say that there was energy and attention and focus there would be an understatement. So it will be fascinating to see how that dynamic continues to play out and maybe shift. Karim, hop in.
So on the predictions about climate change, the impact on climate change, one of the things I've learned in this industry is to never make predictions, especially about the future. But to paraphrase Yogi Berra, but I spoke to a friend of mine who is a very successful, brilliant investment fund manager on Wall Street a few months ago, who told me something I thought was very interesting. He said, over the last decade, the investments that did the best obviously were tech stocks, the Apples, Googles, Microsoft, etc. And his assessment is, over the next decade, where he's putting his money is much more on commodities and oil and gas. And so, I don't have any money riding on any of these predictions, but I did think it was interesting that someone who does do this for a living is betting on oil and gas and commodities. That's certainly been a big winner for 2020 up until now. It remains to be seen whether that will remain the case several years on out.
Judy, you want to make a quick point, and then I want to get us back to Ashley.
Yeah, thanks. The point is the broader one, where I started off with Germany. What's at stake here is just not two competing narratives. It's two competing systems which are clashing with each other. One is the liberal order and the post-1991 era. The other is the old order set out by the Kremlin, which is pre-1991. The big difference is that the pre-1991 Russia was committed to arms control, and we, the West and Russia, just tore up the arms control rule books in the late 1990s, and especially under the Bush and Trump administrations. So essentially, this war really is about who is going to protect the liberal order or who is going to destroy the liberal order.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and so I want to make sure that I get a closing thought from each of you. It can be whatever you want to send us off on what you would like us to take away from this conversation. I will open the bidding by just planting the seed of, I'm curious for each of you who spend your days tracking international relations, to what extent these last 3 weeks, this war, have upended your what your conventional wisdom going in was. We've talked so much about to what extent this scrambles the world order writ large, or in various patches that we're each dedicated to covering. To what extent has this challenged your assumptions? What has surprised you this far in? And why don't we, we'll go out in reverse order of where we began. So Ashley, I'll throw that to you.
Sure, thanks, Mary Louise. I think the biggest reminder is that war has not gone out of style. I mean, we were tempted to think that because the liberal order was so successful in many ways, great powers would not engage in the use of force, and certainly not in the wanton use of force. And I think the Russians have brought us back to our senses on that count, that we've got to take seriously the threats of aggression, especially from major powers. And if we want to protect the liberal order that Judy spoke about, and a sentiment that I share completely, then we've got to have a much more coherent response, as the West. And to me, the silver lining in this huge cloud is the revitalization of Europe as a security actor. That if these trends continue to deepen, we are not going to see Europe simply as a ward of the United States, but a region that is willing to really pull together, not only to protect material interests and to build up the capabilities, as Rose flagged was really necessary, especially in the case of Germany, but an actor that is going to take building defense capabilities seriously, and hopefully in time we will see a willingness to use those defense capabilities in defense of the liberal order. So I see both bad news and good news, and we'll have to see how this shakes out.
Karim, a quick closing parting thought from you.
Yeah, a few quick points. One is, for me, one of the big takeaways is there's nothing new under the sun. And one of the great lessons we learned from the ancient Greeks is how success begets hubris. And Vladimir Putin pushed in Georgia, pushed in Crimea, in Syria. He thought he was invincible, and that kind of success begets hubris, which then begets humility. So hopefully, the implications for the other countries are better, and that he's learned an important lesson. Second is a point which former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster makes, and the term he uses is strategic narcissism, that we oftentimes think that all countries around the world and our adversaries are merely reacting to U.S. policies and have no agency of their own. And I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I think is an important reminder to us about not believing that the world revolves around us and on our actions. And the final point is to emphasize in a different way something that Ashley mentioned about the silver lining. We've all seen these polls over the years that showed younger generations in both the United States and Europe placed less and less importance about living in a democracy because they took it for granted. It was an entitlement that they were born with. And I think hopefully, if there is a silver lining in this war, it is also the importance of what we've been privileged to be born into, free, liberal, democratic systems, and the importance of preserving those kinds of systems.
Thank you. I just had the chance to interview General McMaster late last week, and he did indeed talk about strategic narcissism. So that is a theme he's returned to. Rose, a parting thought from you.
Well, many of you know me as a perpetual optimist. I try to be, and I have to be honest that I have felt anything but optimistic in recent days. But since we heard about silver linings from Ashley and Karim, I think I will join them. And this goes back to a point Judy made right at the outset of our discussion about the way that Putin has driven Europe together into a much more coherent group of countries. It really underscores the points that have just been made about Europe taking on more of a role as a security actor. So my silver lining, Judy, to answer your early question is I do believe that this coherence and this leadership role in Europe will continue to play a role going forward. And I will hope for that because I think that it is going to be necessary in order to move us through this crisis and beyond. And also then to help in moving forward with dealing with the Chinese. Remember that pivot to Asia we were all talking about just a couple of months ago? The United States is going to want to resume its priority attention on Asia going forward. And I think Europe as a bulwark for leadership of the liberal democratic order, the international law-based order, I think that will be very important. So that will be my silver lining, that Europe will remain coherent and willing to lead.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Sasha, very quick parting thought.
Unfortunately, I believe that this war will consume a lot of time and attention from the senior leaders of Biden's team, and that it will be a huge drag and distraction from other priorities. Most importantly, the domestic ones, both in the US and Europe. Inflation will just fuel the same divisions that were leading to Trump, leading to Brexit, and many others. Unless these internal divisions are not addressed and everybody is in celebratory mode of how the West stood up to Putin's aggression, we are in trouble.
Judy, you get the last word.
quick. What has been upended is the sheer bravery and courage of the Ukrainians, that they're out to defend something which is so essential and so universal, and is this freedom of defending their sovereign country. This is the first point. Secondly, I hope the silver lining would be enormous pressure and the resoluteness of the Ukrainians, but also pressure from the other East European countries to keep the pressure on the Europeans and NATO to stick together and don't falter. This is a chance for the West to actually be united and be much more engaged with helping Ukraine.
A call for unity and hope to send us out into the day. I want to say thank you so much to each of you, Sasha, Rose, Judy, Ashley, Karim. This has been fantastic. I have learned so much. I wish we could keep going for another hour, but maybe we can reconvene at some point going forward and see if where things have landed and whether some of these predictions, both on the positive and negative side, have come to pass. Thank you very much. Thank you to our audience for joining us, for giving so many great questions. And thank you to Carnegie for hosting us. It's been a great session. Thank you all. Bye, everybody.